Okay, so we've now covered the key terms starting out in digital health. That was in the first recording for the lecture, and covered Web 2.0, Internet of Things, equity and digital divide. We're now going to cover some key background issues in terms of health. So the question for you is, and I'd like you to pause the recording after I've asked the question and have a think about what the answers might be. You might jot some ideas down. What are the prime causes of illness and disability in New Zealand today? And what are the prime causes of illness and disability in other developed countries? And are there differences in terms of causes of illness and disability when we look at the developing world? So what are the prime causes? That's the first question. The second is, what impact has the internet had on everyday life? What do we take for granted now in our everyday lives that wasn't part of people's lives in, say, the early 90s, the 80s, or prior to that? So pause the recording now and have a look and see what you can identify in terms of causes of illness and disability and impact of internet on everyday life. Okay, I'm assuming you've now unpaused the video, and we are now continuing through to look at these. So in the developed world, so that includes New Zealand, the prime causes of illness and disability are social determinants of health. The World Health Organization define these as the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work and age. So that's everything from socioeconomic status till your cultural identity, your level of education, the type of work you do, the access to the level of access you have to employment, the conditions of employment, the quality of the housing you live in, and so on. These factors are the strongest predictors of illness and disability that we have. And they predict other issues which are associated or causal factors of poor health. So they predict things like rates of cigarette smoking. And so what that means is people who are living more on the margins of society, who are poor, so living in poverty, or socioeconomically deprived, who come from an ethnic minority, particularly an ethnic minority that's experienced colonisation, people with lower levels of education, or who come from a gender or sexual minority, are more likely to experience illness or disability. We're talking about significant illness and disability. And it's not because of anything fundamental to these groups. It's because of the way that within society these groups face stigma, discrimination, lack of access to resources. Their lives are basically more challenging than the dominant groups within society. And the dominant groups within society are able to more easily access factors that are beneficial to long-term health. So things like preventative health care and so on. And so social determinants of health really need to be addressed at a macro level or a societal level. What that means is an attempt to help one individual who, say, is socioeconomically deprived isn't going to solve the problem of social determinants of health. The way that you solve these problems is by addressing the underlying structural factors in society that make life significantly more challenging, difficult and complicated for these groups of people. So for socioeconomic deprivation, for example, we'd need to address issues around housing affordability and housing quality as one example of the sorts of things that we need to look at. We know that Māori have higher rates of illness and disability than Pākehā, and so we need to address the ways in which the healthcare system suits Pākehā and doesn't suit Māori in terms of relationship between a healthcare provider and the person or the people experiencing illness. So we know that there are barriers in terms of accessing the healthcare system that Māori experience at much higher rates than Pākehā, and also that Pacifica face in comparison to Pākehā. So these are the sorts of things that we need to address. Now the challenges for digital health is that digital technologies are increasingly seen as the solution to the many pressing health problems that we have today. But digital technologies in and of themselves very rarely directly address the causal factors that underpin social determinants of health. And this is where the notion of equity comes back in, that it's really social determinants of health are best addressed by strategies that promote equity. And we can do that in digital contexts, but more often than not, the digital solutions that we see, certainly with a number of exceptions, but more often than not, a digital solution to a problem that's caused by social determinants of health is sort of like putting a band-aid over the problem rather than addressing the fundamental causes of the problem. The second key theme is the role of the internet in everyday life. So the internet's had a radical effect on everyday life, and its biggest effect has really been through the massive increase in access to information of all kinds. Information, knowledge, sophisticated knowledge, used to be hard to access. You had to come to university to learn from the professors, so to speak. And if you didn't come to university and sit in a class and listen to some expert, it was really hard to access that knowledge. The knowledge was held in the brains, if you like, of academics and in their publications, their books and journal articles. Those books and journal articles were really limited in availability to university libraries, and you could only access university libraries if you were a university student. Well, now pretty much all the knowledge from any course you might study at university is available online. You can find it somewhere, somehow. And so knowledge is no longer as tightly controlled by groups of elites, such as scholars. And I use elites not in the sense that they're better than anyone, but that they are people in a position to control a particular resource. In this case, we're talking about the control of knowledge, and we're talking about the ability to access knowledge. Well, now anyone with an internet connection can access a vast array of knowledge. And so there's a democratization that's taken place where things are more easy to access. And so that challenges the role of people who have traditionally been knowledge producers. So people like academics, medical researchers, and so on. Whereas previously, knowledge would come from medical textbooks, medical journal articles, and so on. Now, anybody who feels so inclined can go online and create content around a medical issue, such as vaccinations. And even if they do so with the best will in the world, there are clearly fewer quality controls in place to check whether this is sort of a justifiable true belief. Is it accurate knowledge? Does it match the best scientific evidence? Another key source of information historically has been journalism. So newspaper journalism and TV journalism. And journalism has been founded on a principle of objectivity, that the journalist would go and investigate an issue, and they would look to see what were the different angles that people involved in the issue would take. So we look at climate change, for example. We've had 35 years, roughly, of climate change reporting. And for most of those 35 years, there have been the arguments made by scientists around the risks and the causes of climate change, and then the fossil fuel industries arguing back against it. Both arguments being presented to viewers as basically, here's one point of view and here's the other, with relatively little being done to interrogate the quality of those viewpoints. Now that was because of journalistic objectivity, that they're trying to remain neutral and present information for audiences to judge. Well, the idea of objectivity has sort of fallen by the wayside, and the reason for that is because information is online and it's generated very rapidly and disseminated very rapidly. You don't necessarily need a journalist to be objective and present both sides of the story to you anymore, because you can access other sources of information about the same topic or issue. And in fact, journalists now are much less likely to reference objectivity as one of the core tenets of their profession. And again, the risk is that the information being generated is being generated by people who are wholly partisan, which means they have a very clear position in relation to this topic, whether that's climate change, vaccinations, or anything else. And they're really just trying to present information that suits their position and to dismiss or ignore the counter-arguments. And so that's a significant change in terms of the way that the internet has changed knowledge. It's made, more information available, but it's made it sort of more partisan. And of course, some things which you'll be well aware of, probably take for granted. Knowledge can now be shared very quickly, and distance is no longer an issue. So every day, for example, I read blogs about American politics because I'm fascinated by politics, and I'm fascinated by how the American political system works. It's one of those random interests that you'll find academics have. Maybe some of you share it, maybe not. I also read every day, cricket info because I'm a cricket fan, and I read social media articles about ultimate frisbee, which is a sport I coach and I play and I really enjoy. Now, that's pretty much all exclusively generated in the United States and the UK. But I can read it, and it's only a few hours old because it can get shared so quickly. So that's a radical change compared to someone who was playing frisbee in the 1990s or early mid-2000s. And equally, prior to the digital age, someone who was interested in American politics might get a weekly summary of the big political news from a major newspaper, maybe New York Times or Washington Post. That might sort of get sent to them by post every week, and so it would arrive maybe 3 weeks after the story had been generated, and you'd sort of be following things a long, long time after things had actually happened. What else does this the internet facilitate? People who share an interest can congregate and develop expertise. That could just be a really detailed knowledge, so people who are a fan of a particular band or a particular sport or a particular team. But you can develop expertise, you can develop new knowledge, you can develop new skills. We'll look at examples of this later in the semester. But as I mentioned before, the way that social media platforms work is that the algorithms tend to bring content to you that matches what you most readily engage with and like and comment on and so on. So every time you go into a social media platform, whether that's Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, it will be analysing your behaviour, what you're interacting with, and then suggesting new content to you. And it tends to be content that it thinks, well, not that algorithms think, that it predicts will fit your existing worldview. And so people are becoming less and less exposed to the need to interact and engage with people who disagree with them and to try and compromise and find common ground. So that's a pretty major challenge, and it's working to reinforce in-group identification and reinforce out-group divisions. So seeing people who disagree with you as fundamentally wrong, as an enemy, and all those sorts of things. And this has an impact on various aspects of health, also has an impact at political level.